We already had our video about coming up with what was going to be the possible meta comp in Mythic Plus, at the very least at the beginning of the season, as it is very possible, as we talked about, that as you start going into higher keys and things start getting a bit more extreme, a few of the things we mentioned back in our Mythic Plus list could change, like for example the difficulty of saving single players for Resto Druids or Prot Paladin and their high keys survivability compared to something like a Brewmaster Monk or a Prot Warrior. So now it's time to do just about the same when it comes to the raid. Obviously the raid will have way more moving parts than Mythic Plus. It's not just filling in one tank, one healer and then 3 DPS. You also have the Tetris game of filling in all of your raid buffs. So of course when it comes to the raid, if Vengeance is a terrible raid tank and Havoc is a mediocre raid DPS, you can't just ignore them. You have to bring one of the two for your magical damage debuff, right? So the choices of the Mythic Plus picks, ironically, since it's 5 players versus 20, are a bit more flexible, since you can just ignore most of the raid buffs, obviously only having 5 slots, whereas in the raid, since you have 20 players, you kind of want all of them. So when it comes to tanks, purely in terms of power and purely in terms of value, you start with Brewmaster Monk. Brewmaster Monk is a tried and true classic of progression raiding, the very smooth damage intake they have, as well as the quite useful very high damage they can also have, even if in single target, can be also very helpful in the raid. They're not getting any extra freebie points in value because you might need your damage, your damage increase debuff for physical damage, because you're much more likely to also have a Army Super Monk, so you don't really need Brewmaster for that, but still, as a tank, it's very solid. The other one being extremely solid, which actually does gain a bit of value also because of their Battle Shout buff, is Protection Warrior. Protection Warrior is extremely tanky right now, also thanks to Montantain, and the mega buffed Montantain also does very high damage, even again if in single target. They do have the extra value at the moment of Arms Warrior doing very little damage, barely breaking the 5.2 or 5.3 million DPS, whereas, to be fair, Fury has been buffed after the buffs of the last patch. They do now much more acceptable single target damage. They are in fact at like 6th or 7th highest DPS, so the value of bringing Prot just for the buff with Fury now doing good damage has lowered. The ones you're not really gonna need based on how powerful these two are, even with the raid buffs included, are going to be Guardian Druid as well as Vengeance Demon Hunter. There's not really that much of an explanation to have these two tanks brought in your comp. The ones who could still be solid overall, because they have been, brought very often still in races, is Blood DK, as well as another one which does gain value because of the Devotion Aura, is Protection Paladin. So not just because of the Devotion Aura, but because Protection Paladin also does have the bonus value of having cheeses. You might have seen the Ritual First, for example, how often Prot Paladins have been used to cheese mechanics or lessen the difficulty of mechanics thanks to either Blessing of Protection or Spell Warding or their own Bubble, their own immunity, which can help a lot in certain mechanics. And then you have the fact that at the moment both Ret and Holy Paladin are not too good, whereas Holy Paladin is okay, but not one of the best ones. Ret is actually bad in terms of single target, so you do have the extra chance of being brought over these two just because, well, you need a buff, a Devotion Aura buff for your raid comp. So these will be the 4 tanks in contention for your spots in the raid, with Prot Warrior and Brewmaster Monk being the default ones, and then depending on whether or not you do even have spots in your roster for a Paladin buff. Now we can kind of blitz by healers because we have already kind of mentioned them in our healer raid comp, what we think is going to be our default kind of comp in the raid. Now we also mentioned there were quite a few moving parts in here as well, depending on a few other things, because you might be starting with this trio of healers, and then you have the question for the 4th one. It could be a Resto Druid, because Druid at the moment is at the risk of not making it in the raid due to Guardian being poor, as well as Balanced Druid at the moment barely even breaking at like 5.2 million DPS, which is very low. The one who is doing better and sort of acceptable is Feral, but nobody kind of wants to play Feral, so you do have more chances to be able to bring a token an raid buff in your comp in the form of a Resto Druid. As for the other healers, we also mentioned more or less the same thing when it came to Holy Paladin. It could be another raid buff for your comp as a Holy Paladin if you're not running Prot. And then you have other combos like, do we want a double Mistweaver to run double Mistweaver Prez Priest, or do we want perhaps double Priest because somehow Discipline Priest is going to sneak in the end. But if you run Discipline, it's much harder to run it together with Preservation because they have a very similar healing profile, so you might be benching a Preservation Evoker for a Discipline Priest. But I would say that the starting blocks of your comp will be these three. You can then build around these, whether or not you want a second Mistweaver to round up the comp, very unlikely a second Preservation Evoker, or if you want to fill out some raid buffs and some decent healing profiles for this comp like Resto Druid or Holy Paladin. So I guess we can say the ones with the least amount of chances to make it in would be Resto Shaman. That being said, it's still a good state to be in because right now all healers are pretty much doing quite well, but overall I would say this one, for example, would be a pretty decent likelihood of making it in your raid comp. Now, when it comes to DPS, before you even start thinking about who is doing well, you have to start by picking up your buffs. Your buffs, your utility, right? Dead Demo, for example, Warlocks for your Healthstone and your Gate. Shaman, of course, because if you don't have a Shaman healer, you need a DPS, and at the moment Elemental is blasting in single target, whereas Enhancement is dead. Elemental is up by like almost 20% more damage than Enhancement, so obviously they would be making it in. Then past Shaman, you have Rogues. Not only are Rogues doing okay right now, but it doesn't even matter because you still need one of them anyways for the damage reduction. And for the Zoomers right here, Assassination is not called Assa, you know, it's called Sin. That's how we call it in this neighborhood. After Rogue, there is the possibility of picking up Paladin if you aren't running with either a Prot or a Holy Paladin, but not for now. Same goes for Windwalker. Both Rats damage not being very good, and Windwalker damage post nerf being okay. You know, it's in the 5.6 is good. It's still below another like 7 or 8 different specs, so it's not like warranting of a guaranteed spot. Who of course gets a guaranteed spot is Mage, of course, because the intellect, and also because right now Mage is doing well. They have both Frost and Arcane having amongst the higher damage outputs at the moment. Now Hunter technically doesn't have a raid buff, right? But historically they always find a way to making it in anyways, so he will still bring one regardless. Devastation or Augmentation wouldn't necessarily make it if Preservation makes it in, just for the utility of the Evoker at the moment. And then you have Druid. That's a question mark about not making it as a tank, not making it as a healer. You know, the current state of balance being so poor right now, we can't be left but think that it will be buffed, because right now just the damage is just too low to be like realistic to be released in this state. So we're just gonna assume that they're gonna be making it in, just like Vengeance and Havoc. If Vengeance is quite poor as a raid tank, then Havoc is making it in for free in your raid comp. Despite the fact that right now Havoc's damage for both of their hero talents is still quite poor, because getting to around, I guess, 5.5 million damage is mediocre. So starting like this, you only have half of the DPS necessary for your comp. So now you can start looking at the actual good results. You have gotten rid of all the necessary raid buffs and utility and whatnot. If we go over our cooldown planner and we load in our roster, we have all of the necessary raid buffs, debuffs and whatnot that we can put in our comp. You can start looking at the numbers. So the numbers right now, of course, you know, temporary, preliminary and what have you, have both Destro and Demo simultaneously being basically the highest simming specs right now. So this would mean that you would find quite easily a second spot for a for a Warlock in your comp, maybe double Destro, maybe double Demo, depends of course on the damage profile of the fight, but they would be making it in quite easily. Now Elemental and Frost Mage right now are both extremely good, especially after the mega buffs given to Elemental. They're seeming very close, but you have to take into account, you know, the mobility of Frost Mage, the general also popularity of the spec compared to Elemental. So it's more likely you will get a double mage in your comp, and again, because Frost has an extremely flat damage profile, they have no burst windows, they don't really have any extra pockets of damage they can do. It's also very likely you can switch, maybe even both, to Arcane because of their burst windows that they can have compared to Frost Mage. Then again, depending on whether or not you're bringing a Blood DK, there is the question of Frost. So Frost did receive a bunch of nerfs, but despite the bunch of nerfs they have received, Frost and Unholy are still both simming quite well. They are practically both in the like 6 million plus DPS, so you might even have actually two of them in the same comp, especially because not only do you want to fill out your 14 DPS, but you also want to balance them to be at least some 7, 7, 6, 8 melee range spread. So right now you have 1, 2, 3, 4 and only 4 melee DPS at the moment, right? The other one, talking about buffs, if you're not going to run Prot Warrior, before it would only have been for the buff. After Fury was buffed, now Fury does more than enough damage by itself to justify being here, so they would find a spot by themselves. Then yes, it's practically almost guaranteed you will have a priest healer in your comp, but that doesn't mean though that Shadow Priest is bad, because right now Shadow Priest is in the 5.6 million, which is again sort of average. They do still bring a power infusion as well, so it's still fine to be able to bring a Shadow Priest in your comp. And at this point you would only have one DPS spot left. So this is where, you know, the final we need all of our raid buffs value would be very high. So sure, we are gonna keep the Mistweavers in the comp extremely likely, so there is still no need for Windwalker, and after the Windwalker nerfs they are doing basically similar to Shadow Priest damage, so it's not like a must-have like Warlocks at the moment. Ret, depending on if you're running a Prot Paladin, which you very likely will because of how weak Ret is, it's unlikely it's gonna make it in. Of the ones that are doing the best right now, Devastation would make this in due to their 5.9 million sim DPS and their extremely burst oriented profile, also playing Flame Shaper, even more burst. It's gonna be extremely good on a few bosses, even the ones with damage increase phases, which is very good. So purely based on the damage they are currently doing, Devastation is the one who would make it in to fill the comp. What this would leave though is only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 melee DPS, which might be on the low end. This is where you might swap out one of the range DPS for one more melee, and in this case, if we were to look at the performance of the melee DPS, it would pretty much have to be another DK because they are doing the most damage right now. Okay, to be fair, right now, if we were to be fair, this would be a Feral Druid. Feral Druid is doing like more than 10% more damage than Balance, and you're missing melee players, so it would make the most sense to have a Feral over a Balance Druid at the moment. It's just the fact that it's so underplayed compared to Balance right now that you do think it's harder to find that many players going Feral right now. And then you would have the point of the damage profile. Balanced Druid, as you have seen this tier, excels in those kind of fights, like Styx, like One-Armed Bandit, fights where you have spread adds coming from anywhere and everywhere, where your Starfall can gain massive value and your dots can gain massive value. It's not that moving to Feral will actually do anything to those type of fights, even if they are doing like 13% more damage than Balance right now. These will be the specs based on their current performance. You could see making it in a roster for Mythic raiding in basically almost a week, a little over a week, once the season launches. A lot of this very simply has to do with their average performance right now in Sims, and the ones who are missing because of this. You know, enhancement right now is at 5.3 million DPS. You have specs like subtlety, same 5.3-ish DPS. You also have specs like Balance Druid, as we mentioned, as well as Havoc Demon Hunter. They're all on the low end. So when you see other specs doing 5.8, 5.9, even 6 million DPS, we're talking about more than 10% more damage than these other specs. So it's just harder to see them making it in. Even specs like we haven't mentioned, like Red Paladin, specs like Marksmanship are all doing quite poorly in single target. There is of course room for swapping around. We have mentioned a few here like Destro and Demo, or even Frost and Arcane, even something like Assassination and Outlaw. Outlaw right now does have comfortably more single target than Assassination. Assassination is way more about AoE damage and multi-target damage, even if it's spread with their dots compared to Outlaw. Same goes for Unholy and Frost DK, whereas others don't really have a choice. At the moment, Fury is heavily ahead of Arms, Elemental is heavily ahead of Enhancement, on top of being ranged and melee, and you also have BM also comfortably ahead of Marksmanship. So some are more locked in their choice, others can move around in their same class. So at the end, this will be the result, depending on, of course, what you want to slot in your tanks, mentioning that the more likely one is two of these three, depending on the raid buffs you have. Obviously, the more likely one would be Prot Paladin, not because it's better than these two, but because the two Paladins right now, outside of Prot, are just weaker than the options. So you would have to get rid of a Brewmaster Monk, who has no chance of missing the buff because Mistweaver is very meta, and then you have Prot Warrior. So amongst the two, probably this one will be the simplest one to make happen, because you will find a spot for both of these specs in your comp. This experimentation was done because in just a few days, less than 2 weeks, we will be able to start seeing the guilds getting into Mythic first, and seeing exactly which types of comps are running with. So we can then compare what we have seen here with what will happen in live. If we have, for example, massively overestimated warlocks or mages or DKs, and specs like, for example, Feral Druid went under the radar and players actually ended up playing Feral Druid, or maybe even if Blizzard's own balance tuning will end up changing things. But for today, in terms of what we expect is going to go down in the raid, and this is what we have on this Monday. So we can now peacefully leave each other at the beginning of this week, starting by, of course, thanking everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, yeah, turning down my fan and even the AC just for this video to have less noise was not a good idea, because it's 33 degrees right now.